Hey, so thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here for Milo Trujillo's PhD defense. I'll just start with a little bit of explanation of how this is going to work. So Milo has prepared a 45-minute or so presentation for us to explain the results of his time here as a PhD student and the main thesis of his work. The 45-minute presentation will be followed by a public Q&A. So you will all be invited to ask as many questions as you want. Same goes for people online. You can use the chat or raise your hand when we get to that portion of the defense. After the public Q&A, I will ask everyone to leave, and that will be followed by a private Q&A between the committee and the defendant. So I just want to thank all the members of the committee for being here. Alexis is our Professor Briand is our chair. And we have Professor Jeremiah Onalepo from the computer science department, and Jim Bago and myself as advisors to Milo. So I'll just very briefly say, I usually, start PhD defense by explaining that, the result of your PhD is not the thesis, it's you. But Milo was an interesting case because I feel like you came to UVM with a very, very strong idea of what you wanted to do, already like a passion for building a kinder superhighway. And Jim and I's role was more like helping you frame these as research questions and helping you explore the methods. And I think it's rare for people to come and like this early in their research career have a vision for what their research agenda should be. And I think that was a pleasure to see, and it was fun to just be on the journey along with you instead of like guiding you through a mess of complex systems and data science projects. And I also want to say, Milo has been with us for a long time now. He was recruited when we first started the Ocean project, so an open source complex systems and network. And Milo was instrumental in sort of shaping that project and the culture of the way we do research. I feel like there's a second thesis that could exist. It's like building a kinder research environment. That's all the work that you've done as part of the Vermont Complex Systems Center. So thank you for that. And I'm really excited for everyone to get to see the work you've done. The floor is yours.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm Milo, here to talk to you all about building a kinder superhighway. So some very brief background on kind of my perspective and where I'm coming from. Most of my background is originally in computer science and science, technology, and society. And STS is kind of like a sociology adjacent field that studies how science and technology influence our culture, and then how our cultural norms shape the development of new science and technology. And most of my background in that time was focused on computer security and hacking, which will very briefly be relevant in this dissertation. And then since coming here to the Complex Systems Center, I've continued studying social questions, but using our whole bag of data science methods, mostly statistics, machine learning, natural language processing, and network science to look at this kind of group behavior. So in particular, I'm interested in how like online platforms mediate human interaction, and whether or not you're active on platforms like these. Many of your friends and colleagues are, and these kinds of online platforms are instrumental now in how we spread news and memes and develop human culture, and where political announcements are made, and where the events like political violence like January 6th start with a lot of online organization in these spaces. And so I'm really interested in how the design of these spaces influences the way that people interact with one another and those kind of aggregate cultural effects. And in particular, I'm interested in this combination of how the technical design of a platform, so literally what functionality it offers to its users to interact with one another, and the social policies that we instate on these platforms. So what kinds of content we decide to allow and what we don't, and what we choose to help proliferate through like recommendation algorithms, or what we kind of mute and limit its reach, how that shapes aggregate group behavior. And that's kind of the descriptive scientific question. Then the more proactive follow-up question is, okay, given that knowledge, how would we design platforms to help foster the kinds of communities we want to see and the kinds of positive interactions we'd like? And how do we inhibit toxic behavior and the negative aspects of radicalization and some of that? So I'd like to introduce a little bit of framing for how I've been thinking about platforms this way. And this comes from Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and design workshop. And this breaks down different aspects of platforms into kind of three layers. We have operational rules, which are literally what can users do. So can you comment, can you make posts, can you message people privately, report posts to moderators, etc. Then you have the collective rules, and this is basically the context in which those users interact with one another. So thinking about like on Amazon, okay, the elementary action you take is like putting up an Amazon listing for a product, but you're in this space where you're competing against other product listings, and there's some recommendation algorithm and votes by users on quality of products and so on. Or thinking about something like Reddit, where again, you're making more voting on them and it gets ranked and gets removed over time and so on. And then we have this set of constitutional rules, which is basically the process by which all of those other rules and the constitutional rules can be changed. And so this is sort of who has decision-making authority over the way that the platform operates. And often when we're talking about social media platforms, these are companies, either private or public, and so it's okay, the employees of the companies, and especially the higher level executives of the companies that have that kind of decision-making authority. But not always. Sometimes when we're talking about something like an open source project or some platforms like Mastodon, which attempts to be a more decentralized alternative to Twitter. In some of these cases, there's closer to a democratic process, or at least there's a culture of forking, and the idea that like, if you don't like the way that things are run here, you can make your own community and leave, and you can carry over all of the progress that you've made. And in that way, the public has a bit more of a voice in how things run. So, okay, that's the background leading up to this defense. What I'm actually going to be talking about today. We're going to start small and then zoom out and get a little bit larger over time. So starting off with how are users directly impacted by the technical features afforded to them by the platforms that they're on, and how can we measure the impact that those kinds of features and functionality have on people. And we'll be looking at that through collaborative work that lots of users on a platform work on. Then zooming out a little bit to, all right, how are communities as a whole impacted by the social policies on a platform, and in particular by interventions by a platform? But like when a platform changes their policies, how does that impact the communities that are under those rules? Then a little further, looking at how do communities influence one another, and saying, how do we think about like inter-community influence and centralization, and saying, how do we measure when a platform is more dependent on its largest communities versus when there's more independence between them? And then finally, looking a little at how communities migrate between platforms and basically the context in which these groups operate outside of the rules of any individual platform. So with that, jumping into part one, how is user behavior shaped by these technical features afforded to them by platforms? Cool. Our case study here is going to be looking at GitHub. So for those of you who don't do much open source software development, this is a site that hosts open source projects and facilitates people contributing to those open source projects, and hosts like project planning and bug tracking and group discussion and like just about every aspect related to this kind of work. And so for a lot of people, GitHub is synonymous with open source, and this interface is what they think of as open source software development. But it's not everything. This is a company that's a subsidiary of Microsoft, and open source long predates GitHub, and there's still lots of it that exists outside of GitHub. And so we're interested in, okay, how does the design of GitHub as a platform influence open source software development and the people that exist in that context? And so we'd like to get at that question by comparing GitHub to alternatives. And first, GitHub is not the only big player in this space. There are some others like GitLab and Bitbucket, but GitHub is an order of magnitude larger than its biggest competitors here, at least approximately. But we're not really interested in, okay, the 3 or 4 big companies that have source code repositories. We're more interested in what are the smaller alternatives. And there are some. There's GitLab Community Edition, Gitea, and Gogs. All of these basically like run your own GitHub in a box off of a computer that you have in a closet somewhere. And then your own institution or group of friends or whatever can have their own little collaborative space unaffiliated with GitHub. So, okay, we'd like to sample projects from this space. These are still open source projects, but they're not as publicly discoverable as things on GitHub. And so we've been referring to them as the penumbra or the edge of the shadow, because they're not closed source. We have some insight into how they work, but they're a little obscure. So the first challenge here is, how do you find all of these kind of off-label GitHub alternatives? There isn't exactly a big public list of all of them, and you can't really just like do a Google search for Gitea or GOG. Search engines aren't really built to find every single instance of a piece of software like this. But we have some alternatives. We can port scan the entire internet, or at least the whole IPv4 region, and just identify every single web server and the default web page that they reply with, and then search through that HTML to find snippets that look like GOGs or Gitea or whatever. And fortunately, we don't have to do all of that legwork ourselves. There are a few companies that maintain these regular port scans of the internet and make them searchable, somewhat to academics and really aimed towards information security professionals, but that's fine. So doing a few searches here, we find about 60,000 of these independent Git servers, but only about 13% of those have one or more public repositories. And so the thinking is, okay, the rest of the ones we found are being used for closed source software development, and you need like a username and password to get in and see what they're actually working on. That's not really what we're interested in. So of those 13%, we can break down, okay, what software are they using? All right, let's just focus on the top 3 so we don't have to write code for ever more obscure, smaller hosting platforms. And then of those big 3, GitLab Community Edition, GOGs, and Gitea, we're able to look at, all right, where are those geographically distributed, mostly in the global north? And then can we just download every single public repository from all of them to examine how they work? And so from here, we have about 45,000 repositories that are not empty and don't have any commits in common with GitHub. So these are like truly new original repositories that we haven't seen before, from about 1,600 of these GitHub alternative posts. So another thing to note here is, yeah, we found 1,600 of these hosts, but most of them are quite small. So about 70% of them have under 10 repositories or these open source projects. And about 75% have under 100 email addresses or unique email addresses in all of their commit logs. And we're using that as like a very rough proxy for how many humans are involved in doing development here. It's going to be a bit of an overcount for technical reasons of how Git works, but roughly correlates. And the immediate next question is, okay, well, who's using this? Who's deciding not to work on GitHub and seeking out these alternatives? And a lot of it is academia and research labs, and we can figure that out by looking at the domains of the email addresses and saying, okay, if you find a server where 70% of the emails end in uvm.edu, pretty clear that's like an academic institution. And we can see, okay, so several of those, lots of universities host their own for either hosting research projects or hosting student homework and so on. Also, a lot of big open source projects, so things like GNOME and Debian that might have like hundreds of repositories underneath their umbrella will often choose to run their own infrastructure instead of hosting everything on Microsoft's infrastructure. And then a handful of companies too that do either some open source software development or at least like release parts of their code open source for free. We'll have some of these. And we can see there is a really strong academic split. A lot of these servers, especially a lot of the larger ones, have a majority of academic email addresses associated with them. So just by splitting up by servers where most of the emails are academic and servers where they're not, we can see a clear language split in just what these projects are written in. So a lot of science courses are all taught in Java and Python, and we see, oh yeah, there's tons of Java and Python on the academic side. Same with like MATLAB and Jupyter notebooks. And then on the non-academic side, we see more languages that are associated with like mobile software development. Objective-C gets used for a lot of iPhone apps, or like JavaScript for web development and so on. So some clear behavioral differences between the two. So, okay, great, we have this sample. How are we going to compare it to GitHub to understand what GitHub is doing to its population? Here, we're basically just doing a time-matched sample. So we're saying, all right, for every month, figure out how many Penumbra repositories were created in that month, then go select a bunch of GitHub repositories at random that were created during that same month, clone all of them, and then we can do a direct comparison. And we're not controlling for project size or programming language or activity level or anything like that, because we think that those are probably some of the differences that we're most interested in between these two platforms. So, okay, what do we find? Well, there are a lot of different measurements that we could use to compare these, and we didn't know which would be most relevant and which wouldn't. And so we trained a random forest classifier to just distinguish between Penumbra repositories and GitHub repositories based on all of these different metrics. And so on this graph, the x-axis is basically how important did the machine learning classifier find these features for helping distinguish, and then the y-axis is the different features. So we have a lot related to the size of the project, saying, okay, how many files are there? How many commits are there? What's the total number of email addresses associated, et cetera? And then we have a lot of features that are more related to collaboration and saying, okay, how many like people per file do you have like touching the same parts of the code base? Or these metrics around burstiness and inter-event time. So do we have projects that are really consistently contributed to, or do we have ones where there's a flurry of activity and then it's idle for a long time and then another flurry, et cetera? And so what we find is that repositories outside of GitHub tend to have more collaborators and more consistent collaborators, and tend to have longer maintenance periods and less burstiness. So there's just more consistent, longer term activity out here. So, I mean, the interesting question is, well, why is that? And so what we're thinking is, GitHub is really about facilitating project discovery. It's about making these open source projects as public as possible and helping people find and collaborate with you on working on them. And that lends itself to a lot of what we call drive-by contributions. Like someone comes in, they fix one bug or they add one feature they're interested in, and then they leave and they never contribute again. And so you get like a lot more turnover in team activity because of that. Then again, because these projects are so public, a lot of people use GitHub as like their portfolios when they're trying to get into software engineering or even like graduate school. And so a lot of projects posted to GitHub are really portfolio pieces and aren't meant to be like ongoing open source development. And so of course they don't have long maintenance periods after that point. And then lastly, there's a much higher participation cost to working on these projects out in the Penumbra, because you have to know that the project exists ahead of time and go make an account on this server where Gnome or Debian is doing their development in order to finally get onboarded and start contributing. And that higher participation cost also tends to mean that if you're committed enough to get to that point, then you're committed enough to stick around for a while and keep contributing. And so we think that also leads to the team structure being more consistent and the development schedule being more consistent. So that's what we have there. So next, I like to pivot to looking at how community behavior online is shaped by the policies of some of these platforms. Make some water first. So our case study here is going to be looking at subreddit bans. So for those of you that haven't spent much time on Reddit, it's like a series of online forums where anyone can post their own text posts or images or links to other articles, and then people can comment underneath the post in these trees of comments. And there's voting, and it's all broken into these sub-communities called subreddits, where each one has its own focus and its own community rules and its own set of volunteer moderators. And so initially, Reddit was very hands-off. They had this kind of free speech absolutism ideal where they went, we really want to leave it up to each community as to what they consider acceptable content and what they don't. But over time, Reddit has taken a more and more active stance in what content they allow. And they took a big step in June of 2020 when they changed their policies around what constitutes hate speech and harassment and what they're not going to permit. And they banned about 2,000 subreddits that violated these new policies. But notably, they didn't ban any of the users in these communities. They just banned the communities themselves. And users on Reddit can and almost always do participate in many different communities. And so this gives us a great opportunity to look at, okay, well, for everyone that stuck around, what happened before and after, and how does their behavior change? And so more specifically, we're interested in, okay, do they comment more or less after the ban? We might expect that, okay, well, their community is gone, their reason for being here is gone, they're going to comment less. But maybe if they're really mad about that and they want to go post about that, or if they're really trying to find their people again and kind of reestablish that community, maybe activity is going to go up. And similarly, do they kind of change the way that they speak and what language they're using? If there's some kind of in-group vocabulary for the community, do they abandon that when the community is gone, or do they double down on that because they're trying to find their people again? And then, the next follow-ups, are those two heterogeneous between like the top power users in the community and average members of the community? And then are all three of those questions heterogeneous between different subreddits that are banned, or is there a consistent pattern across all of them? So to examine this, we looked at 15 of the biggest banned subreddits from these 2000 and downloaded the like half a year of all posts and comments from each of those subreddits up until the ban. And then from that, identified the top 100 users by number of comments, and then a random selection of 1,000 users that I think had more than 5 comments. There was some small lower threshold on that. And then for each one, download all of their activity from all of Reddit in the 60 days before and after the ban so that we can look at how it changed. There we go. So we're interested in, again, activity and vocabulary. Activity is pretty straightforward. We just take number of comments before, number of comments after, and then rescale that onto an axis of -1 to +1, where -1 is all of their comments were before the ban, and +1 is all of the comments after. In-group vocabulary is a little more involved and interesting. So we want kind of the signature language of this community so that we can understand how they changed that usage of the vernacular after the ban. And to get that, we're going to compare the text we see within this subreddit in that, again, half a year up until the ban to speech on Reddit as a whole during that same time period. And the idea is that by doing that comparison, first, we kind of filter out current events. So things like in 2020, everyone was talking about COVID. It's not a common English word in general, but it's common across all of Reddit during that time period. And so we'd like to filter out current events like that. And then we'd also like to filter out kind of Reddit language that, again, isn't common in English as a whole, but talking about subreddits and upvotes and so on is quite common on Reddit and not something that we really care about. So we figured out how to just uniformly sample comments from all of Reddit during any time period we're interested in and gather a big sample of these, and then compare the subreddit text we have from this subreddit of interest to that large sample of Reddit as a whole using Jensen-Shannon divergence, which I'll get into more in a second. And we skip well-known bot comments, so things like the Wikipedia summarizer bot that posts in parts of Wikipedia articles. Okay, we filter those out. And then we remove the top English stop words because we don't really care if this subreddit uses the, a, or an a little bit more than Reddit as a whole. So ignoring all of those. And then we take the top terms identified from Jensen-Shannon divergence and treat that as in-group vocabulary. And this part is pretty critical, so I want to just dig into how that works in a little bit more detail. The idea with JSD is that we compare, rather than comparing these two text samples directly, we compare the subreddit to a combination of the subreddit and the larger Reddit sample as a whole. And the reason here is a lot of other tools for doing these kind of topic word detections don't work well if you hit a word that only exists in one of your two text samples. They'll give you like division by 0 errors or limits towards infinity and all kinds of funky stuff that we don't really want. But if instead you compare this subreddit to a combination of the subreddit and Reddit as a whole, every word in either text sample appears at least one in the mixture of the two, and so you just don't run into those problems. And then digging in a little bit more into that divergence metric D, that's actually Kolbeck-Leibler divergence. So it's just saying, okay, for every word, look at the frequency with which the word appears in the subreddit times log of the ratio of how often it appears in the subreddit versus how often it appears in the mixture corpus. And the one limitation to keep in mind here is that this kind of method doesn't work very well with very large class imbalances. In particular, if the subreddit is a lot larger than the comparison reference corpus we have, then P of X and M of X will tend to be quite similar to one another. And so this fraction will tend to be close to 1, and so the log will tend to be close to 0, and it'll say none of the terms have relevance. And to some extent, that's unavoidable. I mean, if we compare word frequency in a haiku to word frequency in a 1,000-page book, you'd say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You can't do that comparison. But still, some metrics handle that kind of imbalance a little bit better than others. And so we just have to keep that size limitation in mind when we're choosing how many comments to compare against for this reference corpus. So, okay, that's enough that we can talk about the results here. Here we can plot change in activity level on the x-axis and change in the vocabulary usage on the y-axis. Every dot here is a single user, where the blue dots are the top power users and the orange dots are the random selection of other users. And so we can break this into quadrants, and we can say, okay, up here is where top right is more activity and more vocabulary usage. Bottom left is less activity and less vocabulary usage. And then we can plot those as distributions on the top and on the right, so that we don't have to try to ascertain all of these overlapping dots and figure out what's happening there. So now we can compare subreddits to one another by looking at these distribution plots, and we see immediately, okay, definitely the response is different in different subreddits. In the Donald, that's the Donald Trump subreddit, we see not that much difference for the power users in activity level or vocabulary usage after the ban. It still goes down a little bit, but not a ton. Whereas in like r/gender critical, which is an anti-trans hateful subreddit, the top power users just totally dropped off in activity afterwards, and most of them disappeared. And in other subreddits like debate alt-right, we see kind of a combination of the two, and we see very clearly that the top power users do not respond the same way as the average users on the subreddit do. And rather than trying to look at all 15 of those joint plots together, we can look at just the median change for the top users and for the random users for each of these subreddits. And again, confirm that, okay, yes, different response, and the top users tend to be a lot more impacted than the average users. So, all right, some of these questions are answered. We know that most users have less activity after a ban, especially the top power users. And for some subreddits, the vocabulary changes a lot, and for some changes a lot more minimally. And we know it's heterogeneous between the top and the average users. And we know it's heterogeneous between subreddits, but why do some respond differently than others? So, of course, we only have 15 subreddits in this sample, and so that's not a huge sample size, but we can at least start looking at how can we categorize this, and do we see any early similarities between how these different categories of subreddits respond. And so we can break these down into, okay, there's some dark jokes and racist humor and whatever, those kinds of subreddits. We have these anti-political groups that are just, screw the whole system. We have more, at least modern mainstream right-wing subreddits like the Donald Trump group, and these more extreme right-wing groups that self-identify as being alt-right and neoconservative. And then we have a few that don't fit into those categories. So of the ones that we have understandable categories for, we can try to break it down, say, okay, for like the racist and bigoted humor, there's really not that much of an impact in terms of vocabulary or activity change. And the thinking there is there are a lot of casually racist and bigoted communities, and it's not that hard to find a similar place where you can just keep doing what you're doing. But for these anti-political groups, there's a pretty big change for the top power users. Then for these kind of mainstream right-wing groups, very inconsistent change in vocabulary, not much change in activity. But for the extreme alt-right, everyone decreases in activity significantly, not that much vocabulary change. So, main takeaways here. Yes, we know that top users and average users are impacted differently, and a small subset of especially the top users become more active, while most of them tend to become a lot less active. And then we know that the effect on subreddits is heterogeneous. Again, small sample size for each of these groups, but we see some early patterns that are worth investigating more. Like that there's this smaller effect on these casually bigoted communities that are ostensibly, humor and joke groups, and that it's more effective against these more right-wing extremist groups. And by effective, we mean that their activity drops off, but it's important to note that that often just means that they've left the platform. And so it doesn't mean that like the community has disbanded by any means. It just means Reddit has succeeded in driving them off. And what we've anecdotally observed is also that these groups have such specific ideologies that there aren't really similar communities to them on Reddit, or the closest communities have enough important differences that they really don't get along with one another. And so they have a much harder time just kind of melting back into the fold and continuing what they're doing without leaving the platform and keeping their communities with them. So part 3 is looking at how we think about intergroup influence and centralization on these platforms. So what do we mean by centralization? Because that term gets used for a lot of different purposes. Well, we have these kind of social definitions that centralization should be something about information flow or something about social influence, so that you have some people that are more influential and control what information gets spread, or at least, have tall soapbox, and things that they say tend to reach a lot of people. Or you have this idea of social bridges, of people that participate in multiple communities and so help facilitate moving information from one community to another. Or maybe we're thinking more about decision-making power. We're thinking about who has administrative control over a community, or who sets the content policy for that community, and that kind of centralization of how many hands have the levers of change. And then we have these graph theory definitions of centralization. So we have first vertex level saying, okay, for a single node, what's its degree, what's its betweenness centrality, how well connected is it to the rest of the graph? And we have these kind of group cluster attributes of, assortativity, saying, if you're in a community, how likely are you to connect to other members of that community versus people outside? Or insularity is kind of the inverse of that, of saying, how many connections are there from one community to things outside of that community, or how insular is it? And then we have these graph-wide attributes like density and diameter, of saying like, okay, what's the longest possible chain of social hops I would need to cross this entire network? And so what we'd like ideally is to have those graph theory measurements, at least some of them, align with these kind of social intuitions we have about what centralization means. And so I have a few examples here to kind of think about that problem. In this left graph, most of us kind of agree this feels centralized. There's one community in the middle, this big orange dot that has more users than any other community, and it acts as a bridge connecting 4 other communities together. And so that seems to have a pretty central role in the whole graph. In this decentralized example in the middle, the communities aren't all of the same size, but they're kind of similar, and none have some central hub role connecting all of the others together. And then we have this ambiguous case where there's this one community that is just order of magnitude bigger than everything else, way more users, but it's not that well connected with the rest of the graph. And in fact, if you were to remove it in that one edge, the rest of this graph is identical to the decentralized case. And so would we think about that as centralized or not? Well, by degree centrality or by betweenness centrality, absolutely it is. That one community is part of the shortest hops between tons of different nodes and has really high importance. But that just doesn't seem to fit with our idea that that community has influence over the rest of the graph. And so what I'm asserting, and then we'll build some methods around, is that community influence is some combination of the size of the community and its topological role connecting other parts of the graph together. And so I've been working on this kind of disruption metric, as we've been calling it, for how you measure the influence that a community has, or how you measure how influential the biggest communities are over an entire network in general. And so we're doing this by basically removing a community and then measuring what happens to the people that are left. So we're going to cumulatively remove communities from these plots, starting with the biggest, then the 2 biggest, 3 biggest, and so on. And we remove all of the users that are only connected to those communities we've just removed. And then for any users that are left that have survived, we say, okay, what percentage of the original edges have been cut? So, thinking about this example, if we remove this biggest community and all the users that are only in it, then what happens to the rest of the graph? Well, it loses 1 edge. And so the damage is pretty minimal. And so that's the way that we're framing this kind of influence problem. And For random graphs, for Arrow's graphs, you can actually solve this closed form, and you can say, okay, well, we can calculate how many communities there should be of size n and how many edges they're going to have to users that are in smaller communities that will still survive. And you can just solve this out purely quantitatively, or purely analytically. But I'm primarily interested in looking at like real world social network data. And so I'm not going to focus on solving this closed form. We're going to look at sample data and solve it that way. So I'm looking exclusively at bipartite graphs. That's graphs that have like communities and users. And that's because that represents this kind of social problem really well. We often have like subreddits and the users that participate in the subreddits, and then we remove the subreddit and say what happens to the rest of the population. Or, for an older example, Usenet, you have news groups and people writing in them. Mastodon, you have these server instances, and then people can follow users on their own instance and other instances. YouTube, you've got channels, people can comment on videos in channels. Git, you have these Git servers people can contribute to projects on. But because I'm interested in how the biggest communities impact much smaller communities, we're going to limit ourselves to platforms that are small enough that we don't have to do any kind of subsampling, and we can look at the entire graph and won't like accidentally miss some of the smallest communities. So instead of looking at Reddit, we're going to look at Vote, which is kind of the alt-right knockoff Reddit. Similarly, instead of YouTube, we'll be looking at BitChute, the alt-right YouTube clone. And then instead of looking at all Git traffic in general, or looking at a huge platform like GitHub, we're going to use the Penumbra again, the sample of open source projects from the start of this defense. Yeah, great. So this is what those cumulative distribution plots look like. Each dot is us removing first the biggest community, then the two biggest, three biggest, and so on. And we can see that in general, disruption should steadily increase for a while as we remove more and more communities, at least until we've done a lot of damage and removed a lot of them. Eventually, once you've removed like the larger half of the graph, you end up splintering the remaining graph so much that when you remove a community, you don't really do much to the rest of the graph. And so that's why most of these lines flatten out as you go on. And in some cases, we see removing the largest community does very little to the rest of the graph. And it's not until you remove a couple that you actually start to get up there. And in a few cases, we even see this very spiky behavior where first there's more disruption and then the damage to the network actually goes down as we remove even more communities. And we'll dig into that example a bit more in a moment. But first, I want to focus on this red line and saying, okay, why does this start so darn low compared to everything else and then leap up? And that's because Vote has two incredibly large, totally insular communities. So this is a community-to-community projection. That is, every node is a community, and there's an edge between two nodes if there are shared users between those two communities. I think there's a minimum threshold of 30 users. And so we see, okay, most of Vote is this giant hairball. It's all interconnected. It's all here. It all centers on these more popular communities in the middle. But then off to the right, we see these two massive nodes for the QAnon research Vote and the 8chan Vote that are, by orders of magnitude bigger than any of the other communities and have almost no crossover whatsoever with the rest of the graph. And speaking anecdotally, basically what happened here is Vote was well established, and then the QAnon group got banned off of Reddit. And so they just migrated wholesale over to this platform. They're not really participating in the rest of the platform. They just set up shop in a corner and they're doing their thing, but they migrated en masse. And so now they look the largest by a ton. And so, yeah, removing that community really does nothing to the rest of the graph. So, yeah, this ambiguous example is not just like a thought experiment or a mathematical possibility, but is very much what we're observing in real-world network data. Now, coming back to this Penumbra example, why is it spiky? That's really weird. And that's basically just saying that it's an extremely sparse network, that thinking about these Git servers, if you participate on like the Debian Git server and you're contributing to projects there, it's unlikely that you're also contributing to projects on another Git server, or if you are, just like one or two, few connections. And so what we see is, all right, we remove a community, that has a really big impact on one of the other servers in the Penumbra. But then when we remove that other server, it's basically like cauterizing the damage that we've done. And now it's, okay, you removed two communities that were interconnected and shared a lot of communities, or shared a lot of users, and they're not really well connected to the rest of the graph. And so you've undone some of that harm. Cool. So overall, yeah, I'm arguing that social influence is about this combination of group size and the topological role of the group. And we've built this metric that considers both of those things. And I think we've demonstrated with the vote example that population distribution plots can be pretty misleading. And the fact that you have a really heavily skewed population distribution does not necessarily mean that the whole platform is centered on those one or two biggest communities. And we can also use this tool to examine claims of centralization. So Mastodon aspires to be this very very decentralized alternative to Twitter. It's all about, instead of having just a handful of Twitter administrators or Elon Musk directing everything, what if we have lots of different communities that are all run independently? And if you don't like the way that it's run, you can go make your own and migrate away. And that's a really interesting aspiration, but there we go. But what we actually see here is that no, the biggest 3 or so communities have a lot of tie-ins with the rest of the platform. And in fact, a ton of the social circle on the Fediverse, as they call it, centers on these biggest communities. And so the people operating those communities do actually have a lot of social influence over what everybody sees and what content is permissible. So finally, looking at community migration and understanding how communities spread from one platform to another or starting to, and looking at how that behavior changes. So we know that communities that are deplatformed, like in our Reddit example, often migrate to their own site. We have a few anecdotal examples, like when the Donald was banned, they made their own Reddit alternative, the Donald.win. And we would like to follow those migrations and understand, okay, how much of the population migrates and how does that behavior change? Is it like the top most aggressive users are the ones that migrate and then they become more radical because there's less oversight and because the less engaged members have dropped away? We don't really know. And there are a lot fewer studies than we'd like in this space, in part because proving ground truth is really hard. If you have two communities on different platforms, how do you demonstrate that they're the same group of people? And kind of the default here is doing username matching, saying, okay, you found an account on 2 different sites with the same name, it's probably the same person. But people change their usernames all the time as they migrate. And so that's a really noisy signal that doesn't work that great. And so the direction I'd like to go is using a group linguistic fingerprint of, if we can say, okay, there are these 2 groups of people and they're talking about the same things in the same way and the same kind of language, the same kind of context, maybe that's a strong enough signal that even if you can't identify individual people, we can be pretty confident it's the same group of people. But there are a couple challenges with this approach. The first is you need to be able to distinguish people that are in a community from people that are talking about the community. They're probably going to use some similar vocabulary because they're talking about the same subjects, but they're going to use those words in nuanced different ways. And humans can usually tell the 2 apart pretty easily, but can we build some metric for doing it automatically at scale? And then the second problem is compensating for linguistic drift over time. And that's that a lot of these groups are talking about current events and the subjects that they're engaged with are going to change over time. And so if you build a classifier that can identify one community by what they're talking about, that's going to lose accuracy over time. And so how do we kind of account for that? So I'm mostly going to focus on that first problem. We selected pairs of subreddits and people talking about either that subreddit directly or at least that same kind of topic from a really different perspective. So like here we have No New Normal, which is like an anti-COVID conspiracy group. And then we have COVIDiots, which is calling COVID deniers idiots. We have like some pro-law enforcement and some anti-law enforcement groups and so on and so forth. We can do word comparisons. This is using similar metrics to that Jensen-Shannon divergence. So on the left is what words are more prominent in No New Normal and what are more prominent in this COVIDiots group. And we can see, okay, yeah, there are some differences. No New Normal talks a lot more about lockdowns and hysteria and Trump politics, and the other calls people idiots a lot and talks more about masking. So definitely possible comparisons. And we can distinguish between these 2 sets of communities using machine learning. Here we used a combination of a long-former model and term frequency, inverse document frequency, logistic regression model, but those technical details aren't what I want to focus on. The main takeaway is just that, yes, you can build a classifier that can distinguish between the 2. And what's more interesting is when is it easier to distinguish and when is it not? And so we can see, okay, which users do we correctly label? These are all cumulative distribution plots where we say, okay, as the number of subreddit comments per user goes up, we have an easier and easier time identifying them. That's okay. If you've been in the community longer, it's easier to figure out whether you're part of the community or not. And total subreddit karma correlates with that. It's again saying if you have a lot of points because you've been here a long time, then we have an easy time identifying you. And then mean subreddit karma really doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter whether you're popular in the community. It just matters whether you've been here a long time. And then you start to pick up more of the vocabulary and it starts to become more obvious from reading all of your text, which community you're a part of. And again, these are cumulative plots. So we don't necessarily care about the drop off in the tail at the end. That's saying that, okay, the 2 users that had the most karma, we happened to label incorrectly, but that doesn't speak to a broader pattern in the classifier. So the second problem is thinking about linguistic drift and thinking about what happens as the topics of conversation drift away and your classifier becomes less and less accurate over time. And this is kind of moving from published established work to ongoing and future work. Our idea here is basically, can we identify what language is the most consistent in a group over time that still uniquely identifies it from other communities? So this is a shift between November and then the following June of this known and normal subreddit. And we see, okay, early on, they're talking a lot about masks and lockdowns, and you see a lot of holidays because this is early days of the pandemic when we're saying, when will things be back to normal? Will it be like by Thanksgiving or by Christmas? And by 6 months later, we've locked on to talking about getting the jab and the experimental vaccine and some specific officials like Fauci. And so, or like Wuhan and ivermectin and all that fun stuff. And so basically, can we compensate by filtering out these more turbulent terms that turn over really quickly and then focusing on what language is most consistent? And this is very early methodology again, but we have this comparison between no new normal and COVIDiots without doing any filtering. And then on the right, we have it with filtering out those turbulent words from a couple slides ago. And we can see, okay, if we filter out Fauci and talking about getting the jab, then the part that's consistent about no new normal is this conspiratorial language that they're talking about doomers, they're talking about the government, the narrative that the mainstream media has, and this power of propaganda and that kind of language, even as the exact topics like ivermectin might fade in and out. So this is not ready for real world use yet, but it at least shows that like, yeah, there's maybe some promise with this approach. It could be done. And then hopefully once we kind of formalize that methodology and you're able to pick out the in-group vocabulary that's most consistent, then maybe we could validate with some case studies like the Donald moving to the Donald.win. And then we can start examining, okay, now that we can confidently follow communities based on their fingerprint, can we observe what happens in their community behavior after that move? So that's what I have for research. And I'd just like to close with a few thoughts on broader changes in this space. So first, I think that we have kind of a reductionistic tendency to focus on the smallest studyable unit in this space. That's often like looking at a single platform or looking at a single community within a platform. And we're sort of trained to think that if there are fewer uncontrolled variables, that we have better science. And so of course you want to grab the smallest thing that you can examine and wrap your head around. But in practice, human communities don't work that way. We're all like deeply interconnected with one another, and people are often members of lots of different communities on several different platforms at the same time and move content between all of those platforms. And so I think it's a lot more appropriate to study whole ecosystems of communities at a time and try to study these patterns of how content and behavior spreads between these communities in these different contexts. So the last thing I'd like to end on is the encroaching darkness consuming us all, and that's the dearth of data availability. And most recently, Twitter and Reddit both cut off their data access for academics last year. Twitter, perhaps because of Elon Musk's personal choices after he took over the company, Reddit in a very profit-driven motive of they want to charge AI companies like OpenAI to use all of their comments and posts as training data for their large language models. And academics just got kind of caught up in that and lost all of their access. Companies like Meta haven't provided easy academic access for many, many years. And these invite-only spaces like Telegram and Discord really don't provide any external insight. You have to be part of the community to see what's occurring in them. And this is often where groups move when they're banned from spaces like Reddit. And then the other place people move is building their own alt tech platforms. If you get banned off of Reddit, you build your own knockoff Reddit and move there. And these platforms never have open APIs and are usually hostile to academic researchers. And so how can we understand online group behavior, especially in these more negative spaces, when all of our data access is being cut off? So I see a few options here. One is we can scrape these platforms rather than using easy provided APIs, and that will probably violate their terms of service. And we can have a discussion of when that's ethically appropriate. That if you're studying online extremism and you're studying like real world political violence that's organized online, maybe that takes priority over a line in the terms of service saying, please do not send automated requests to scrape our website, and that's worthwhile. Another option here is utilizing data breaches that just last year, a few of these platforms, Gab, the kind of alt-right Twitter clone, and the Oath Keepers, just like a far-right militia group, were both hacked and had like all of their internal chats leaked. And journalists jumped on this opportunity to say like, wow, here's this rare chance to study how these groups organize and a lot of their internal communications. And academics have largely shied away from using those kinds of data sources despite their availability. And there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, there's challenges related to privacy and saying like, when is it worth pursuing this data, even though some of these communications are private and not meant to be shared with us? And there's challenges around procedures within academia. I think computer science and particularly computational social science often utilize a loophole where we say anything that's published on the web is like it's published in a newspaper. It's not a human subject being studied because it's already published material and we're just reading it and we have implicit consent to read it. And so we don't need IRB approval for like anything in our field. And that is less the case if you have to like build a bot that sits in a Discord chat room in order to observe what people are saying, or if we're utilizing data breaches that contain direct messages or group chats. And so, we really need to have a reckoning with how invasive these kinds of methods are and when it is appropriate to use them anyway, and what kinds of ethical oversight we need in order to do this safely. But at the same time, I think there are times where this is justifiable and we should pursue this path in order to understand these dark corners of the internet. So that's what I have for all of you. I'd like to thank my incredible advisors and committee members for being very patient with me and supporting me through all of this. And all of my co-authors on papers that have made up this dissertation, and all of my additional co-authors on papers beyond this dissertation. So thank you very much.
Okay, so people online, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat and I'll relay your questions to Milo. People in the room, feel free to use your physical hand. And I'm really curious to hear what questions you all have about the thesis. I see celebration emojis. I see a hand up.
So awesome. A lot of great, like, especially like empirical analysis here on like before and after interventions and things like that. What role do you think like modeling of interventions plays here? Like, what is the state of that in this type of field as far as, Reddit presumably had some idea of what effect that their actions were going to take, and then there was an actual effect after that. Like, what is the state of how well we understand and could actually model the effects of interventions before they're enacted?
That's a really great question. I think that's an area that this field is pretty lacking in. There's a lot of work on individual case studies. There's a lot of analysis of, hey, we saw this thing online, here's our statistical analysis, here's what we've seen. There hasn't been nearly as much theory building about like, okay, what are the patterns between lots of these bands and what can we expect and what can we not? Occasionally you get like more controlled case studies of like, all right, we did hypothesis testing and we've built our own little homegrown platform where we can try these experiments out. There's a lot more of that in like the HCI and computer supported collaborative work environments. And that's where some of this modeling takes place, but I think that hasn't been as much of a focus, that a lot of the people in this space, these computational social scientists, are more experimentalists and less theoreticians and modelers. Yeah.
Excellent talk. I was curious about something you talked about at the beginning, which was like the three rules. You were talking about constitutional, operational, and one other.
Collective, yes.
Collective. And I was curious, like, what's the assumption there? So like, let's suppose I have two platforms that are essentially identical in those regards. Like, what would you be able to say based on that theory?
Yeah, so I think that vocabulary and framing is most useful for just talking about like what level of control are we talking about and what level of functionality, and trying to distinguish like what are things that are about the context in which people are interacting versus what are literally things that the site allows us to do. So it's not really a taxonomy, but yeah, if you're comparing two platforms, you would really want to dig into in more detail. Okay, what are the specific differences in functionality? And this is more just letting you, build a hierarchy out of like what kinds of rules are different between these platforms.
Thanks.
Yeah, all right.
So on the Reddit section,
Mhm.
you were talking about one section of the graph that was less vocab, more comments, I believe. I might also mistake what it exactly said, but it was yeah. The flash of whole thing. Sorry, I didn't mean. Yeah. So let's vocab more activity. Less vocab
Yes.
use, more activity use. Do you have any insights in this study? It could also just be a question of more analysis, but the possibility that groups that have their subreddits banned moving to groups maybe on the opposite side of the aisle, and everyone's talking about the same things, but they are having more debate possibly in there. Like there's that dichotomy of we're using the same language, but we are debating each other. We're not in an echo, like is this an echo chamber or not?
That's a really good question. I don't think we considered that in this study, but we did run into that when we were looking at that later one of how do you distinguish people in groups versus onlookers talking about the group. Is like people from COVIDiots do sometimes come and raid No New Normal and talk about you're all idiots for not believing in COVID, right? And so you do need to account for like, okay, well, if most of your activity is in that other group and you're getting totally downvoted into oblivion here, maybe we should filter that out from the data set. And so, from a control perspective, that is one way you can approach it, is saying like, okay, let's ignore comments that have a really low popularity in this group and say those are probably external trolls messing with it. That's kind of the experimentalist solution to like cleaning that noise out, but that doesn't answer your deeper question about like, are we seeing more debate after these bans? I don't have an answer to that. I haven't observed it, but we weren't explicitly looking for that here.
Which I think is good.
Yeah. Well,
so one of the things you mentioned was that Mastodon failed to be the decentralized platform it wanted to be. What elements do you think lead to centralization in platforms? And how could you tweak the knobs and dials of design to create a true decentralized platform?
that's a really good question. So I think that gets at whether platforms are centered around people or topics. So like, I think one really big distinction between I think that's the primary difference between somewhere like Reddit and somewhere like Twitter, right? Is on Twitter, you're following a bunch of people. And so it's all based around those people, and it breaks out of context. If you're following someone because they're, I don't know, a popular YouTube streamer, then you can't just look at them in that space and ignore their political views or the art they're retweeting or whatever. It blurs all of those contexts together, right? And so that leads to a lot of social hegemony and kind of rich get richer schemes of you want to be in a community space where you're following more popular people, and more popular people are going to be retweeted more and further out into the graph, and so more people are going to discover them and start following them, and you get this kind of rolling effect. And that means that, like, okay, yeah, these three biggest Mastodon communities are also some of the earliest Mastodon communities and had a lot of that social momentum of a lot of the most popular members were on those three servers, and everyone follows them and follows the people they retweet or retweet in Mastodon's case, and so on, right? Versus in a space more like Reddit, where it's partitioned into, okay, this is the corner where we're talking about this thing, this is the corner where we're talking about that other thing, you don't see that same kind of amplification, because if you're not interested in what that one community is talking about, you're not going to follow the people in that community, and it just gives you a different dynamic. And so I think Mastodon's mission of decentralization is kind of at odds with the social impulse of you're on a network where you're following people because you want to hear what they have to say, and that kind of lends itself to following these louder voices and finding more popular people. So that would be my answer, is you can't really have decentralization in a network that is centered on following micro celebrities.
I think there was a last question.
Yeah, so one thing you mentioned about the Reddit study, where you said that the groups which left Reddit didn't have enough in common with their closest cousin groups, so they couldn't meld back in. Is that a hypothesis, or like has anecdotal evidence, or did you test that?
That was anecdotal evidence of, like, we dropped in on a couple of the, well, so for these users that remained, we looked at the top users and we looked at, okay, what subreddits are they active on? Because we were hoping to do some network analysis of, like, can we look at migration within Reddit from one subreddit to another? We didn't end up getting there in that paper, but we did kind of look at that data and saw, like, oh yeah, they kind of tried to move to some other subreddits and it fizzled out and they didn't stay active there as much. So no, just anecdotal evidence from just examining some of those power users.
That's kind of interesting. I don't know if you were thinking about like what methods you would use to try to tell whether groups are close. In general, that could be a useful tool.
I like that idea.
So we had a lot of people online, and I want to be a good online host. So Oliver, you have your hand up.
I do. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So first of all, really great presentation, Milo, and congratulations. This is really awesome. I'm so happy for you. And so I have a little bit more of a general question, that's sort of a more socially science question that I'll throw at you. And so my question sort of revolves around how you see other sort of corporate or other private interests shaping this platform design and community behavior. Because I'm wondering, like, Reddit in 2020 banned like 2,000 subreddits and got rid of those. And so I'm wondering, like, the reasoning behind why Reddit would choose to do that now, because it sort of seems like they did that in their own sort of interest, and that shaped a ton of the community behavior. And now that has driven a lot of people to go to other types of platforms. So I'm sort of wondering how you see, like, these larger interests shaping community behavior and platform design as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, one detail I didn't go into, Reddit is currently, well, Reddit has been a private company for most of its history and has just gone public, and at the time was really trying to work on how can we boost our stock price, and that involved how can we make ourselves more appealing to advertisers, and that in turn involved, let's not have the reputation of hosting a bunch of really hateful communities, and that absolutely influenced their decision to update these policies and ban a lot of them. But interestingly, we're not only seeing that in these corporate controlled spaces. So thinking about Mastodon, they're notoriously hostile to advertisers. They, all community run, donation driven, yeah, very little corporate influence in pretty much any of that space. And they also take a much more proactive stance to banning certain kinds of content, and especially like more extreme stances on banning transphobia and other things that like Twitter and Reddit haven't taken as proactive policies on. And so we do see some attempt at, let's make these spaces more welcoming and more positive for their own right without necessarily corporate influence. So you're absolutely right. Like, stock price and wanting to be appealing to advertisers does play a role in the motivations for some of these companies, but isn't the only explanation for why they're updating these policies.
So I have a final question. In the interest of time, I'll ask you to answer quickly to a very hard question.
Oh, great.
So Aaron online is asking if you have considered how the results of this research might be used by or for policymakers who want to preemptively regulate or shape online interactions.
Yeah, so one area that I worry about is that a lot of these companies are just worried about, again, improving their own appeal from the outside. So thinking about like, okay, Reddit bans some of these groups and then the activity levels drop off. And so like, all right, great, the extreme alt-right groups have disappeared from our platform. The problem is solved. And from their perspective, maybe that's true, but we know from a larger perspective that no, they're just migrating to their own sites where there is no external administrative control over what they're doing. And so I'm hoping this kind of work can, help influence those policies, but preferably outside of corporate decision-making. And, when we're talking about the European Union has been debating some regulations that would apply to all social media and has been thinking about like how do we regulate this entire ecosystem rather than policies within a single company. And so I'm hoping this kind of research could more benefit that kind of decision making and thinking about what are the kind of externalities and longer term effects of running a ban within one community that impact other communities and other platforms. There's my medium length answer to that.
That's great. That's great. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Milo for the presentation. As I warned earlier, we'll be moving to a private portion of the defense. So thank you for coming. People online, I will be kicking you out.